Government of India recently imposed import restrictions on laptops, tablets and servers. The restriction is that one cannot import these pieces of equipment without a prior permit or a license. Originally it was with immediate effect, and then with some intense pushback from industry, the effective date was deferred to November 1st. Why was this done? Is it because we want to make sure we do not get key electronic products from an unfriendly neighbor? Or was it to give local manufacturing a nudge and hence help create jobs? Whatever the intent was, the critical question to ask is, will the move serve its intended purpose? Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, Bharat Kumar. This imposition of restrictions on import of laptops, tablets and servers has thrown up a variety of reactions from both industry and academia and other quarters. But a couple of reasons or ostensible reasons stand out for most. One is that India should not depend on a source of electronic components and products, a source that cannot be trusted, because that could throw up security loopholes threatening our national security. Our sister publication Business Line counters this in an editorial that if this were a reference, or this meaning the source that cannot be trusted, were a reference to imports from China, then there is no easy solution. It says, Chinese brands make up over half of the annual computer imports, valued at $8 billion. The government of India is emphatic that this move does not take us back to the license Raj days or that it is protectionist. Minister of State for IT and Electronics, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, says, the recent import restrictions announced are certainly not an attempt to go back to the license Raj or to put a brake on imports of hardware. We are only ensuring that we have a trusted supply chain for our digital economy. We have done this with smartphone manufacturing, and today global brands are using India as a base, and we want the same for IT hardware manufacturing. The key words there that he used are trusted supply chain. There have been howls of protest from industry here, especially from the parts of the industry that will be negatively impacted by it if they don't already have a robust manufacturing ecosystem here. But there are others who are ready to raise their output. Lenovo, headquartered in China, is one such that has a manufacturing unit in India. It's interesting and significant that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has actually called out such trends recently, trends by governments worldwide putting out policies with an eye on raising domestic manufacturing. The IMF refers to these as industrial policies, but industrial policies that come with a make-at-home flavor. In an article that came out in June, it says, trade interventions are on the rise in the form of industrial policies and subsidies, import restrictions based on national security and environmental concerns, and export controls to punish geopolitical rivals and ensure domestic supply. The author says that there has been a misreading of history. He says other nations have been copying and are copying the US. The US has historically had a high tariff regime. But he points out that the US overtook free trade Britain in per capita income in the late 19th century because it focused not on increasing manufacturing productivity but service productivity. Western Europe saw growth by shifting resources from agriculture into industry and services. Protecting agriculture likely slowed this transition for Germany, he says. And he warns that just because the US, Europe and China can afford subsidies, it does not mean that others can follow suit. In another article in its F&D magazine that came out in March this year, the IMF contrasts France's success in setting up an aircraft manufacturing ecosystem against China's failed attempts to do so. It says France was successful in absorbing Airbus's losses, offering subsidies and financing for fixed development costs in an attempt to counter Boeing's dominance of the aircraft manufacturer's market. China, the author points out, tried replicating this success with its Comac C919 aircraft, but the project has been hampered by delays and there has been no global recognition yet because of air safety concerns. And this despite China having seen success with its industrial policy that helped it develop its high-speed railway network. The IMF points out that there is a lesson to be learned here, that promoting national champions can sometimes be effective, but it's not a guaranteed recipe for success. And in cases of market failure, the government may find it challenging to address the problem without causing significant distortions or incurring high fiscal costs. At the beginning of this episode, we mentioned two plausible reasons why the government of India could have opted for such import curbs. The second is that such a move could possibly encourage local manufacture and hence help job creation. Several voices warn that such a goal is not easily achievable even with such a policy. They point to India's own PLI scheme, Production Linked Incentive Scheme. This is applicable for several sectors including computer hardware manufacture. It's ironical that Apple, which has begun moving phone production from China to other countries, including in India, has not taken up the subsidy for computer manufacture under the PLI scheme. It still opts to source its Mac computers from elsewhere. To understand what roadblocks that such a policy could face, we spoke to Dr. Ajay Chibber, Distinguished Visiting Scholar, Institute of International Economic Policy, George Washington University in the US. He makes two key points. One is that industries or sectors that depend on competitively priced electronics, such as research and development or education or even the IT-enabled services sectors, and they depend on such products that should be or ought to be competitively priced. And if lack of competition, adequate competition, drives up those prices, then these dependent sectors could be impacted. And two, he cites IMF research on geoeconomic fragmentation. Incidentally, it's a concept that we have dwelt on in an earlier episode of Business Matters. He cites IMF research that says that such fragmentation could cost all of us 1 to 2% of global GDP. Let's hear what he has to say in detail.
Well, I mean, historically we had after independence, we had gone into this period of import substitution and import controls and curbs. In fact, more than that, we even had production licenses. So there was a lot of that directed industrial policy and built on import controls. But then, the result was that our growth rate was not comparable to many other countries, and especially later when many of the East Asian countries went into more export-led growth, we fell behind, and we had this notoriously referred to as the Hindu growth rate of 3.5% to 4%, which my old professor Raj Krishna, he was my professor at the Delhi School of Economics. He's the one who coined that phrase, somewhat sarcastically, of course, referring to it as the Hindu growth rate. And then we had this period of import liberalization. And I also wrote a piece just a few weeks ago in the Business Standard, which showed that our export growth has been quite impressive. Maybe not in all areas, maybe not in manufacturers as much as we would have liked to. But, our share in global exports, which was around 0.5% in 1990, in 2023, our share in global exports had risen to 2.5%. So this policy of opening up on liberalization has, of course, meant that we have become more open to importing from the rest of the world, but it has also helped our exports in very significant ways. So I worry now that we are, after all the liberalization we did by bringing down tariffs, removing import bans, we are going back to this now, and what I warn is that this could lead us back into that very low growth period that we had earlier. And we want the target that the Ministry of Commerce has set for India's exports is 2 trillion by 2030, of which 1 trillion will be in goods and 1 trillion will be in services. So if we want to have service export growth of that magnitude and speed and scale, I think of laptops and iPads these days as, daily consumer products and inputs in a way into making India the IT hub that it had become. So yes, we must produce more of these in India, but the last thing we should be doing is banning imports in order to increase production in India. We should find other ways to do that. There are lots of studies which suggest that industrial policy has worked to catch up. But I personally think that these studies tend to exaggerate, first of all, the effect of industrial policy. I mean, when you look at East Asia and its success in exports, or China's success, I am not sure very much of it has come from industrial policy by itself. I think it's come from the fact that they had strong, human capital foundations. They had developed very good infrastructure. They, of course, had labor markets that were not restricted in any way. So they, and then on top of that, they dabbled here and there in industrial policy. But I think the effect of that is exaggerated. And one of the reasons I say that, not in my article, but I'm saying it to you now, is I lived in Vietnam as the World Bank director for Vietnam. And Vietnam has had huge success, and it is one of today the biggest success story on exports, and one of our biggest competitors in a way, the China plus one policy, is Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is one of the most open countries in the world. Its trade to GDP ratio is about 180%, meaning that it imports almost 80-90% of its GDP and exports 70-80% of its GDP. So they don't think that the way to go about doing this is through import bans. They want to, in fact, make a competitive domestic industry built on buying imports from wherever they can find them at the best available price, and then exporting those products. And I think the United States is now also making a huge mistake in pumping so much money into industrial policy. Of course, they are couching it also as a policy to address climate change, and but it's largely built around an idea that they have to bring production back to the United States. And of course, their competition is with China, but they've also ended up hurting many of their allies, like in Europe, who are now retaliating by putting subsidies of their own. So, as that IMF paper shows, it's sort of beggar thy neighbor policies, which will end up costing everybody and costing the consumer more than anybody else, right, and the taxpayer.
It'll be interesting to watch what dynamics shape the industry after November 1st. But before we wind down this episode, here's your factoid in our Did You Know section. Did you know that the IMF says Bangladesh has reaped benefits from opening up to foreign investment, which brings in capital and technology, so much so that the country now has a higher per capita income than India? And for this week's quiz question, who said this? Copying other countries' solutions to problems you do not have, or focusing on trendy issues that are not really important, is a recipe for inefficiency, if not disaster. And before you start wondering, here's the answer to last week's quiz question. The question was, how long did it take for the middle class population globally to reach 1 billion count after the Industrial Revolution began? The answer is, it was only around 1985 that the middle class reached 1 billion people, about 150 years after the start of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Interestingly, it then took 21 years until 2006 for the middle class to add a second billion. Much of this reflects the extraordinary growth of China. The third billion was added to the global middle class in 9 years. Today, we are on pace to add another billion in 7 years and a fifth billion in 6 more years by 2028. That's all we have for you in this episode. But before you go away, do not forget to like, share, subscribe, and importantly, click on the bell icon. Till we meet again, have a lovely week ahead.